All right, get ready for a deep dive, folks, because today we're tackling Herbert Spencer. Now, before you tune out thinking this is just another history lesson, trust me, Spencer's ideas are surprisingly relevant even now.
Oh, absolutely. He's often unfairly dismissed, I think, as just a social Darwinist.
Yeah.
But if we really dig into his work, we see someone wrestling with these, complex questions about ethics, about how societies evolve.
That's what always gets me hooked, finding the unexpected. So let's unpack this social Darwinist label, right?
Yeah.
It makes him sound like, I don't know, it's all about survival of the fittest, justifying like cutthroat capitalism. Is that the real story?
Well, a lot of times that interpretation comes from, people taking Spencer's work and kind of twisting it to fit their own agendas. What's really fascinating is that Spencer himself made a distinction between fittest and best. He argued that with human evolution, you actually see a kind of an ethical check that's not present in the animal kingdom.
An ethical check. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more.
So Spencer believed the highest form of this check was something he called rational utilitarianism. So for him, human progress wasn't just about, brute survival, but about figuring out about ethical living, figuring out the actions that lead to the greatest good.
Hold on, though, because that brings up a big question for me. How could Spencer be a utilitarian, you know, focused on the greatest good for the greatest number and a champion for individual liberty? Those seem like they could clash sometimes.
Yeah, and that tension is really at the heart of Spencer's work, and it's what makes him so interesting. He believed, very much like John Stuart Mill, that true happiness comes from individuals being able to, freely develop their abilities. That's why he was so passionate about what he called equal freedom, this idea that everyone's liberty is only limited by the equal liberty of others.
Equal freedom. So it sounds like he's trying to find this balance between like the good of the whole and individual freedom.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it goes even further than that. So for Spencer, moral rights, especially, rights to life and liberty, were absolutely fundamental. They weren't just, nice add-ons. They were like essential consequences of equal freedom.
So for Spencer, ethics wasn't some like abstract concept floating around out there. It was like deeply rooted in our very evolution.
Yeah.
How did he explain that connection between our biology and morality?
Yeah. Well, this is where his background in, biology and sociology really shines through. He brought together ideas from associationism, Lamarckism, intuitionism, and of course, utilitarianism to explain how morality actually evolved.
Okay, whoa. Let's break that down a little bit. What did he mean by all of those terms?
Sure. Essentially, what he believed was that actions that repeatedly, produce pleasure, they get linked with feelings of approval in our minds. And this is key. He thought those feelings actually get passed down through generations. It's a concept known as Lamarckian inheritance, where acquired traits can be inherited.
So over time, what benefits the group becomes like ingrained in us, not just through learning, but through our like biology. That's a pretty radical concept.
It is. And Spencer argued that this is how societies internalize utilitarian principles, right? It becomes intuitive. We don't have to constantly be calculating the greatest good. It becomes part of our moral instincts.
Okay, I'm starting to see why Spencer's still relevant today. But, I noticed in our notes here that he makes this distinction between something called rational and empirical utilitarianism. Could you explain that for us?
Absolutely. This is a core part of his philosophy. So think of empirical utilitarianism as focusing on the observable consequences, right? It's about seeing what works in practice. Rational utilitarianism, on the other hand, is more about, seeking deeper principles and kind of deducing moral rules from them. It's about
Yeah.
finding the underlying reasons why certain actions are right or wrong.
So empirical is like what we learn from experience, and rational is more about reasoning, like figuring out the fundamental rules.
Exactly. And Spencer actually considered rational utilitarianism to be a more advanced form, He argued that it wasn't enough to just observe. We needed to understand the underlying principles behind ethical behavior. But here's the twist. He actually ends up shifting away from some of his strongly held rational views later on.
Ooh, a plot twist. I love how these deep dives always uncover something unexpected. So it seems like he was always wrestling with these big ideas, not afraid to change his mind. Speaking of change, we've talked about how Spencer was a champion of individual liberty, but what about his views on political rights? Was he like a strict libertarian?
Not quite. He made this fascinating distinction between what he called rights, properly so called, which were based on his idea of equal freedom, and then political rights, which he saw as more temporary, reflecting the current state of societal evolution.
So rights properly so-called were like The bedrock, the unchanging ethical principles, and then political rights were more like tools that could adapt to the circumstances.
That's a great way to put it. One really intriguing example of a political right that he initially supported was the right to ignore the state.
Wait, the right to just, like, ignore the government? Tell me more.
He believed that this right would help keep the government in check, right? The idea was if citizens could choose not to be protected by the state and refuse to pay taxes, it would force the government to really focus on its core function, which was protecting individual rights.
Wow, that's a radical idea even today. Did he always believe in this right to ignore the state?
Actually, no. Later in his career, he changed his stance, arguing that, since citizens benefit from the social order that the government maintains, they can't really just, opt out completely.
So even Spencer, the champion of individual liberty, saw the value of the social contract. It seems like he was constantly reevaluating his ideas and not afraid to admit when his thinking evolved.
Absolutely. And this shift wasn't limited to just, the right to ignore the state. He also changed his position on land nationalization. Early on, he was a strong supporter.
Really? That seems at odds with the limited government philosophy he's known for.
It does. Initially, he believed that private land ownership actually went against the principle of equal freedom because it denied equal access to resources. But later on, much to the dismay of thinkers like Henry George, who saw him as an ally in land reform, he abandoned this view.
This is fascinating. Spencer's ideas are even more complex than I anticipated.
Sure.
We're seeing a thinker who truly wrestled with these issues, not just a caricature of a social Darwinist. This deep dive is already revealing a lot more than I expected.
You're right, and this is just the beginning. These shifts in his thinking on political rights are actually deeply connected to the core of his philosophy, especially his views on utilitarianism.
I'm all ears. Let's delve deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
When we were talking before about Spencer's distinction between rational and empirical utilitarianism, it's interesting because his shifting views on issues like land nationalization and the right to ignore the state really highlight how deeply his utilitarianism ran, even when it meant revising his initial rational deductions.
Yeah, that's right. It seemed like he favored rational utilitarianism, deducing moral rules from first principles. But you mentioned that he kind of moved away from some of those views. Are you saying these changes in his political stances are examples of that shift?
Exactly. When you look closely at his reasoning, it becomes clear that Spencer didn't actually abandon those positions just because they clashed with his principle of equal freedom. He really changed his mind because he became convinced that those policies wouldn't actually lead to the best outcomes, the greatest happiness, for the greatest number. So empirical observations, in a sense, kind of trumped his earlier, more abstract reasoning.
So even though he championed this idea of rational utilitarianism, he was still deeply pragmatic, always looking at real-world consequences. He wasn't just some armchair philosopher. He wanted to see how his ideas played out in society.
Exactly. And that actually makes him more aligned with what we'd now call, a more traditional empirical utilitarian like Henry Sidgwick.
Sidgwick. But wasn't he pretty critical of Spencer?
He was, but it's important to understand the context. Sidgwick, who was, a brilliant philosopher in his own right, really took issue with Spencer's claim to have developed a truly deductive and rational form of utilitarianism. Sidgwick argued that you can't scientifically prove those deductions, those assumptions about pleasure, pain, and happiness. For him, utilitarianism had to be grounded in observation, in experience, acknowledging the limits of our knowledge.
So even though they disagreed on the approach, they were both ultimately concerned with how to create a society that maximized happiness. They were grappling with the same fundamental question, just from different angles.
That's a great way to put it. And, if we dig a little deeper, we actually find even more common ground. Both Spencer and Sidgwick acknowledge the importance of moral intuitions, seeing them as arising from our evolutionary history.
Right. We discuss how Spencer believed that, certain actions become associated with pleasure and approval, and those associations get passed down.
Okay.
Right. It sounds like Sidgwick, while maybe not agreeing with Spencer's Lamarckian explanation, was also really attuned to this idea of evolved morality.
Exactly. Sidgwick called it common sense morality. And he saw it as a, generally reliable guide to action because it evolved to promote social harmony. He argued that we should consult our moral intuitions, but also be willing to refine them using reason and observation.
So both believed in the power of moral intuition, but also like the need to critically examine those intuitions.
Yeah.
That seems to resonate with, a lot of contemporary moral philosophy where there's like growing interest in how our evolved psychology influences our moral judgments.
Absolutely. And that's why revisiting Spencer is so valuable, right? He was wrestling with these issues over a century ago, and his insights are still relevant to debates in ethics today. Perhaps the most striking parallel between Spencer and Sidgwick is their shared belief in individual liberty.
Oh, yes. That concept of equal freedom, where each individual's liberty is limited only by the equal liberty of others, has been really central to our discussion.
Exactly. And Sidgwick, while not using that exact phrase, clearly championed individual autonomy and self-development in his work. They both believed that a society that allowed individuals to, freely exercise their faculties, to pursue their own goals without, undue interference from the state, would ultimately be happier and more prosperous.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. We've been discussing Spencer's theoretical framework, but how did his ideas on individual liberty actually translate into concrete political positions? We touched upon his changing views on land nationalization and the right to ignore the state. What else can you tell us about his political philosophy?
Well, one of the most intriguing aspects is actually his evolving perspective on the right to vote.
Voting rights.
Hmm.
I thought that was a given for, any liberal thinker.
You would think. But Spencer's views on suffrage were surprisingly complex, and as with many of his positions, underwent, significant changes over time. Early on, he saw universal suffrage, the right of all citizens to vote, as a crucial safeguard against government overreach. He believed that, giving everyone a voice in the political process would make it much harder for the state to infringe upon individual liberties.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like the classic argument for democratic participation that it protects freedoms. But you said his views evolved. What happened?
Well, observing the political landscape of his time, Spencer became increasingly disillusioned with the effectiveness of universal suffrage. He worried that extending the franchise to everyone, including women, could lead to what he called over-legislation.
Over-legislation, meaning too much government intervention, even if it's, democratically decided upon.
Exactly. Spencer feared that a large electorate, maybe swayed by, populist sentiments or short-term thinking, could push for policies that would ultimately undermine individual liberty and economic progress. He saw the potential for a tyranny of the majority, where the rights of individuals could be trampled by the will of the crowd.
That's quite a shift for someone who initially supported universal suffrage. It seems like he was really grappling with that tension between, individual rights and the potential downsides of democratic decision-making.
He was, and this internal struggle, I think, really highlights a crucial aspect of Spencer's thought, his profound commitment to pragmatism.
Pragmatism, you mean like focusing on what works in practice, on practical solutions rather than rigid ideology.
Precisely. Spencer was constantly testing his ideas against reality, revising them when he felt they weren't actually achieving the desired outcomes. And, his evolving views on suffrage, on land nationalization, on the right to ignore the state, all of these demonstrate this pragmatic streak.
So, if we're trying to sum up Spencer's legacy as a political thinker, the label social Darwinist just doesn't capture the complexity of his thought.
Absolutely not. He was a complex figure who grappled with some very fundamental questions about, individual freedom, about the role of government and the path to a just and prosperous society. And his ideas, they were sometimes controversial, often evolving, but always, always thought-provoking.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive, and I feel like we've only just begun to explore the depths of Spencer's thought. There's so much more to uncover.
There certainly is. And one of the most intriguing aspects of his legacy is the lasting impact he had on later thinkers, especially in the field of ethics. We've touched on his connections to Sidgwick, but his influence extends even further, reaching figures like John Rawls and the development of modern liberal thought.
John Rawls, the author of A Theory of Justice. Now, that's a surprising connection. I'm eager to hear more about how Spencer's ideas influenced later thinkers like Rawls. But I think we'll have to save that discussion for the final part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. All right, so we're back and ready to kind of continue our deep dive into the complex world of Herbert Spencer. Before the break, we were talking about how his ideas, especially his focus on individual liberty, might have actually influenced later thinkers. And you mentioned John Rawls, the author of, A Theory of Justice, which is considered like a cornerstone of modern liberal thought. I'm really curious to hear more about that connection.
Yeah, it is a fascinating link that's not often explored. At first glance, they might seem like very different thinkers, right? Rawls, writing in the 20th century, was really focused on creating a theory of justice that would ensure fairness and equality in a modern liberal society. And Spencer, as we've seen, was, a 19th century thinker, very much concerned with individual liberty and, the limits of government intervention.
So where do they intersect? How did Spencer, who's often associated with a more laissez-faire approach, influence someone like Rawls, who's deeply concerned with social justice?
Well, one key connection, I think, lies in their shared emphasis on individual rights. Remember Spencer's concept of equal freedom, this idea that each individual's liberty is limited only by the equal liberty of others. This principle, while interpreted differently, by each thinker, kind of forms a common thread.
So are you saying that Rawls, even with his focus on, social justice and fairness, took inspiration from Spencer's ideas about individual liberty?
Yeah, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. So Rawls' famous thought experiment, the original position, where individuals are tasked with designing a just society from behind a veil of ignorance, actually has echoes of Spencer's concern for impartial justice. So in the original position, individuals don't know their social status, talents, or even their conception of the good. They have to design these principles of justice that would be fair to everyone, regardless of their position in society. So this emphasis on impartiality, on making sure that the principles of justice are fair to all, it really resonates, I think, with Spencer's insistence on equal freedom as the foundation of a just society.
That's a really interesting connection. It sounds like both Spencer and Rawls were trying to figure out how to create a society that guarantees basic rights and liberties for all individuals, even if they approach the problem from very different angles.
Exactly. And another point of intersection lies in their understanding of the relationship between individual freedom and social cooperation. Spencer, despite his reputation for advocating limited government, really recognized the need for some degree of social organization and cooperation. He saw society as kind of an evolving organism, and he believed that individuals, through their voluntary interactions, could actually create a complex and harmonious social order.
So it's not just about individual liberty in a vacuum. It's about how individual freedoms can coexist and even thrive within a well-functioning society.
Precisely. And this idea that individual freedom and social cooperation aren't necessarily mutually exclusive but can actually reinforce each other is absolutely central to Rawls's theory of justice as well. Rawls argues that a just society is one that allows for, the greatest possible amount of individual liberty that's compatible with a similar liberty for others.
That reminds me of Spencer's equal freedom principle. It's like they're both trying to find that sweet spot where individual freedom is maximized, but without undermining the stability and fairness of the whole society.
Yeah, exactly. And this emphasis on, finding a balance between individual liberty and social well-being, I think it's one of the most enduring legacies of both Spencer and Rawls. They both recognize that a just society isn't just about maximizing individual freedom, at all costs, nor is it about imposing strict controls on individual behavior in the name of social order. It's really about finding that delicate equilibrium where individual rights are protected, but where individuals also recognize their responsibilities to each other and to the society as a whole.
That's a pretty powerful insight, and one that's incredibly relevant, I think, to the challenges that we're facing today, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're constantly grappling with these questions about how to balance individual freedoms with the need to, address social problems, promote equality, and create a more just and sustainable world.
Yeah.
And it seems like Spencer, even with his sometimes controversial views, was wrestling with these same fundamental tensions over a century ago.
He was. And while we may not agree, with all his conclusions, engaging with his work, I think, really forces us to think critically about our own assumptions about individual liberty, about social responsibility, about the role of government.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I mean, we've gone from debunking this myth of Spencer as a simple social Darwinist to uncovering all these surprising nuances of his thought. We've even discovered, these unexpected connections to modern thinkers like John Rawls. It's clear that Herbert Spencer, far from being some relic of the past, still has a lot to teach us about the enduring challenges of, creating a just and flourishing society.
I completely agree, and I really hope our listeners will be inspired to explore Spencer's work for themselves and discover all those unexpected insights that await. Who knows? You might just find yourself reevaluating your own beliefs about freedom, about responsibility, and the very nature of a just society.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, challenging our assumptions, expanding our perspectives, and sparking new conversations. So to our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas. You never know what treasures you might uncover.